Welcome to a special guest edition of the BumbleKast. I'm your host, Ian Flynn, the Bumble King, and joining me as always is my Bumble co-host, Kyle, JCRB Krause.
Hello, I'm here. I am merely here to facilitate a special guest episode, though, because I don't think I'm going to be doing a whole heck of a lot of talking this time, because we got a special guest on board, returning to the show.
Yes, welcome back to the BumbleKast, Laviarray.
All right. Pleasure to be here, guys.
Yes, welcome back. The questioner formerly known as Dekokamii.
Mm-hmm.
For folks who may have missed your initial episode, who are you? Why are you here? What is it that you want on the Bumble Quest?
Sure. So I go by Laviarray on several platforms, mainly on Tumblr and Twitter. And I have been known as a bit of a critic when it comes to a lot of the work that's been coming out of IDW in particular. I'm coming out here mainly so I can get a better idea about like what you're ultimately going for as a writer, and especially for this time in particular, I want to focus more on what are you trying to do in terms of not only your villains, but also in terms of the themes that you're ultimately going for in the book itself. So that's what most of the questions I'm going to be asking about are going to be around today.
All right, so there's our thesis for the episode. So if you're ready, let's just get to it.
All right. So to lay some groundwork, I want to try to go ahead and double confirm information that we have from the last time and put that in here as well. So let's start with the basics. First off, when it comes to what you are ultimately able to do on the book, now I completely understand that when it comes to everything that's being put into the book, you do have to work alongside SEGA when it comes to what ultimately comes down the book, especially what ultimately ends up getting approved by them. But to confirm what you said last time, it is usually around like 99% what you want to do ends up in the book, correct?
More or less. It's hard to put like a blanket statement on it because it's malleable. Mm-hmm. What is okay now may not be okay later, and what was not on the table before may become available later on. And nowadays, it's more than just SEGA's approval, because there's always the editorial side of things as well. They have some direction. And now that Evan is lead writer, whenever I contribute, I need to take into account whatever she has going on so that I'm not throwing her off her game.
Okay. All right, then. Next up. So when it comes to the initial start of the book, to confirm, you're the one who ultimately made the decision to start IDW at the end of Forces, correct?
Yeah, that's what I pitched, because my thinking was this is the newest game. This is going to be what's freshest in the most minds. IDW and SEGA both liked that direction, and here we are. Okay.
So my follow-up question to that in particular is, would it have been possible, with SEGA's approval, obviously, to try to go in a different direction where you made your own universe, or at the very least didn't have to completely go in the same direction as the games do?
Yes and no, depending on just how broad you mean go in my own direction. If we're talking like the old school, like pre-boot Archie days, no, that was. Say again?
Sorry. Let me rephrase a little bit. So I know that you can't just obviously you couldn't just go to all the insane stuff that happened in pre-boot Archie. I know that's off the table. But my question is more in the sense of, did you have to make the comic directly in the game universe? That's really close to what I'm looking for, as long as you got SEGA's approval for it.
Oh, yeah. It needed to be recognizable to the modern Sonic brand. We couldn't do something that was, here is uniquely IDW, in the same vein that Boom was uniquely Boom. This was its modern Sonic branding. It needs to fit with what it is.
I'll go ahead and just leave it at that. Next up. So one of the things that kind of took me back a little bit was when you ended up saying that a lot of the issues that you were trying to do in IDW were meant to be connected to shonen in some way. So the first question I kind of ask is, how would you define shonen?
Not connected so much as inspired by.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I mean stuff where you have very self-contained arcs that can fit into a larger premise. Like just because it's something a little more current, like My Hero Academia. And I'm granted more anime than manga, so no spoilers. I know there's some crazy stuff happening right now, and I don't want to know. Don't tell me.
Oh, don't worry. I'm not following My Hero Academia. Don't worry about it.
Okay, but like there is an overall goal for the story. The author has an end in mind, and there are themes of exponential growth, that things are going to reach a tipping point and society isn't necessarily prepared for it. But the first arc you get is Deku and his ascension into All Might's protege and graduating into UA and all that. That's self-contained, but it still builds towards a larger goal. Now, we can't exactly do that with Sonic because there is no end goal. This is a perpetual franchise. There is no finale. We don't get to end Sonic. Right. But I did want it, like compared to the Archie days, where there were still arcs, but it was much more decompressed. We would have multiple subplots percolating in the background. Everything was this network of ideas that was ever expanding and ever growing and could potentially become unwieldy, but with the right group on board, you could still focus it. And that means that when that book got the plug pulled on it, that's a lot of ideas and content that just goes poof. Whereas with IDW, my approach is more self-contained stuff that feels Sonic, that tells its adventure, and it can build on itself, but it isn't constructed with the mindset of we're going to get this payoff 5 years down the line. It's let's tell one story well and then move on and tell the next story well within the context of the previous one.
Okay, so
Revenge of Neo Metal was meant to be 12 issues. Here's reintroducing the cast to people who've never picked up a Sonic book before. Here's Neo Metal as the deep cut villain for the hardcore fans, and the heroes save the day. They win. That was a cool adventure. Oh, look, we're bringing Eggman back. And then we get into Metal Virus and yada, yada, yada. Okay,
so here's the thing. The reason why that took me back in particular is because while I get the connection that you just made, I would honestly say that's just more of a hybrid attempt at doing hybrid episodic and serialized storytelling, which, to be clear, I do agree with. But when it comes to shonen, it's usually not just about having more or less self-contained arcs. It's usually more about when it comes to how the action and the drama usually tie into the character writing. Like, for example, we can stick with, I'm trying to make sure I come up with a good one for My Hero. One in particular is at the end of the first season, where after having All Might trying to spend so much time trying to make sure that he keeps the secret safe about what ultimately has happened to him, you get to have that proper build up to him really having to deal with the villain who's been who's basically able to just receive all of his attacks, but receive and just counter all of his attacks, and he has to go beyond to be able to try to deal with that, which is meant to be kind of not necessarily a culmination of his arc, but really a clear way to establish what his motivation, his conflict is, but to see how much he can do in order to try to overcome and deal with that problem. So I don't necessarily say, which I want to get into a bit later, but I feel like that's where it kind of needs to come in a little bit, but I want to try jumping back into that later, especially when I get to Surgeon Kit. So, okay.
Now,
so coming back, yes.
I mean, to a point, it's not a perfect analogy, to be sure, because it's woefully not the same format. God, to have the ability to just dwell on moments like manga does would be so nice. But I also don't want to see any of my friends in the professional industry have to deal with the kind of stressors that the mangaka do. Good Lord. That, and since it is a perpetual brand, there is an inability necessarily to do serious advancement, because at the end of the day, the core cast has to return to status quo. but I get where you're coming from.
Right. Which, to be clear, I am aware of that, and that's, again, something I want to come back to when I get to Search and Kit. But before we get to that, I want to cover a couple of things with Team Dark for a second. I know they're not really antagonists here, but that's something I want to try following up with. So a while ago, you ended up saying that Team Dark. I want to try and make sure that I'm. You can clarify if I'm wrong here, but Team Dark isn't necessarily meant to be like a ride or die kind of team. At least when you were ultimately told that a couple of years ago, and you've more or less been, and that's something that you've been dealing with when it comes to the criticism for how they've been handling the comics. Correct?
Yeah, the official word is they're not a team, that they are not even friends, and that's infinitely frustrating.
So here's the thing, and I totally see how that would be frustrating. But the question I have is, in particular, is why not take advantage of that? Because outside of at best that endpoint of Melivirus arc when Rouge is on the ship with Zavok, these three have never been out of an issue with each other. These three are always relatively within the same issue of each other. So if they aren't meant to be a team, why not take advantage of that and show them either working on their own or showing a different dynamic with them with other characters? Because outside of like a couple of exposition exchanges, they haven't really gotten a chance to do that to this point.
Yeah, fair enough. But that's also part of the issue with such a large ensemble cast and finding ways to put it together. That and the dynamic of Team Dark, while it may not be an officially acknowledged thing, is still a crowd pleaser. People want to see the three of them working together and doing cool things because they have done cool stuff together in the games.
Right, but see, this honestly ends up bringing up two different questions. Starting off with but continuing with Team Dark, why? I get that it is like really pleasing to the fans, but why prioritize fan appreciation just for seeing their dynamic when you can't really capitalize on the dynamic versus trying to take them in a new direction where fans could possibly appreciate that?
Well, that's not to say that we won't do that at some point. Again, we can only feature the characters so many at a time, and some of them don't stand on their own as well as others. Shadow is difficult to utilize at the moment, we will say graciously.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I adore Omega, he is a one-note character that really doesn't carry a lot of weight on his own. I am interested to see his story in the upcoming annual, which, depending on when you're listening to this episode, it may already be out. So go grab the 2022 annual. Rouge is also kind of a hard nut to crack because given the context of the games, she's a heroic individual in her deeds, but the notes always come in to make her more selfish, and that doesn't jive with a lot of people's perceptions of her. She's not in the same boat as Shadow, not by a long shot, but she also has some difficulties in approaching how to utilize her. So,
okay, that was actually my next question, because I'm kind of that's not the first time you said that Rouge keeps getting notes about being selfish. But I've gone through that book, gone through the issues with her several times. How is she where is her selfishness supposed to be a factor?
It's just in like the word choices we've had to use, like when she was helping the folks escape the city during Metal Virus.
Okay.
We had to be we had to adjust some of the dialogue. I can't remember exactly what it was. It's been a while. But we had to adjust the dialogue so that it didn't sound like she was doing it for the benefit of the people, but for herself.
Okay.
Which, okay.
I mean, I could see that being a bit of a restriction, or I guess, like I'm trying to find the exact page right now, but I don't really, I get how having kind of a bit of restriction about like how you can't have her just be more purely morally good when it comes to her dialogue can be a bit of a restriction, but how would that necessarily prevent her from being able to have any type of interaction, or being able to be utilized on a more regular basis, especially when it comes to possibly using that to help complement and contrast Sonic's character.
Well, sure, she could show up on her own. It's just finding the right story to do that. And we just haven't done that yet.
Okay. All right, so we'll just move away from Roosh right now. Next up, okay, I know this is a bit of a dead horse, but I want to try getting a little bit more clarification about this. So when it comes to going back to issue 19, from my understanding from everything around the rumors, was that initially the plan was to have Shadow sacrifice himself, end up knocking himself unconscious, but then the zombies would be able to reform and then infect him. But SEGA ultimately said no to that. So was the idea that, but however, when I end up kind of bringing this up last time, you kind of brought it up. You kind of end up saying like you felt like you could have done something a little bit better. So I'm kind of curious, like, I know you can't go into too much detail, but was the position ultimately you're looking to they ultimately said no, and you just had to try to find some way to still have them more or less get out of the plot for that arc?
I don't know where he got those rumors from because that's pure fanfic.
Okay.
The original thing that I wanted to do was that Shadow, in his arrogance, thought that he would be immune because he was the ultimate life form, and that as the virus encroached upon him, he'd take off his limiter rings and use that Chaos Shadow kind of pseudo form to burn it off, thinking that he had the power to overwhelm it, and that it just continued to adapt until he was overcome. And that ultimately it was his hubris that brought him down. Ultimately, it was decided that introducing the limiter rings was too much to do at that juncture, along with the Chaos Shadow form. So without that kind of central conceit, it just came out as it did. Where I say I probably could have done something better is, instead of sticking to my guns and trying to maintain the structure as it was, even though we were on a limited amount of time for revision, I should have just stepped back and looked at the whole thing and said, okay, how do I approach this from a completely different angle rather than try to make what was there work? Maybe I would have found a more satisfying way to bring things about, but that's all in the past, and what's done is done.
Okay, so here's my question. Why? So that was really just more so I can get proper information. My actual question is, why do we need that to happen there? Like, we already established, why did we need to have that particular character moment happen at that point in the arc?
To escalate things. That's part of the general construction of Metal Virus, is that everything gets increasingly worse. Shadow himself is an incredibly powerful character, and if he were to get his hands on Chaos Emerald, Chaos Control could potentially render a lot of the threat of Metal Virus moot. So to see someone of Sonic's caliber, if not arguably stronger, fall to the virus and now become part of the problem is one more tick on the it's getting worse bar.
All right, so here's my issue. So I agree with you that, especially when it comes to stories like this, you should be looking to try to escalate the drama as appropriate. However, the counter argument I kind of have is, why escalate it that way? Like, one of the criticisms I've launched in particular is that a lot of times when you need characters to do certain things to keep the plot moving, a lot of times you'll either have them do something stupid or incompetent to keep the plot moving. And while I get the idea that Shadow's pride has always been an issue, if there's already the solution of running fast can get the virus off, or if you wanted to try to escalate that situation there, why not just have the virus show, or the virus or the zombies, to show that they can be even just as much, if not more, of a threat to be able to take down Shadow? Granted, that still kind of puts him in the Vegeta territory just for how he ultimately gets jobbed, but for a setup to increase the tension around the Metal Virus. But why not have them show the Metal Virus be that much of a threat versus having Shadow ultimately having to do something stupid to get infected?
So you're suggesting that the alternative is that he just gets mobbed?
Not necessarily. I'm not personally speaking. I don't think he should have gotten infected at all. This is not just because I think Shadow should be immune from anything else, but one of the things about that arc in particular, especially when it comes to how Sonic is handled, is that and I believe that Sonic needs a character like this in general, is that he needs someone to ego check him. Not necessarily someone like Sally, because Sally has her own issues, but needs someone who is able to be in a position where they can call out Sonic for his mistakes and being able to butt heads with him as a proper Lancer, as a proper rival. And especially if Knuckles has to be on Angel Island, Shadow falls into that role a lot better. So especially from what I remember last time, you were trying to make the theme be about how Sonic needs to stand by his decisions regardless of the consequences. Why not keep someone there? Why not keep someone in the cast who can do a good job serving as a proper steelman to that counter, to be a counter argument for that mindset?
Well, one, the rest of the cast did call him out at varying degrees, and two, we would not have been able to use Shadow in that way. We had to, in the original Shadow and Sonic fight back in the Mr. Tinker stuff, we had to cut 90% of Shadow's dialogue because he apparently just doesn't talk to Sonic.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a conversationalist. He doesn't debate. He doesn't speak his mind. He doesn't tell people his opinions. He just does. Can you hear the fatigue in my voice? So I agree with you in that having him be a counterpoint to Sonic's worldview would have been interesting. It absolutely would have. But at this juncture, we would not have been able to use him in that way. Okay.
So let's follow up about that a little bit. So you say that other characters call him out for this, and I'm like, besides Espio, who else does? Vector, I kind of count Vector, but those are the only real two that I remember doing that. Does anyone else?
It's been a bit. Let me think.
Because there are three characters who end up ultimately have any type of commentary about this. We have Vector at issue 17, where he ends up talking about where he ends up just making a passing joke about next time we put him in jail, we're not having this discussion anymore. Espio at 24, I believe, when he had that one page back and forth with Sonic, and then Tangle. But Tangle, if anything, just kind of alleviates him of all guilt and just says, no, it's okay that you ended up doing this. You made the right decision. You couldn't have predicted everything else. So that's kind of, which, if anything, considering how short Vector was, where it's a blinky missing kind of thing, the only proper counter arc was Espio, and Tangle just kind of undercuts everything that he was saying beforehand. And I've even gotten fans saying, fans at that time were kind of just going yeah, Espio was just mad at that point. We should just listen to Tangle at that. So it's he's kind of the only counter argument, and no one really takes him seriously. And no one and several people that I was interacting with from your that are fans of this arc, they don't take him seriously on that front. Was anyone else?
I can't think of anyone off the top of my head, so maybe right there. But it wasn't Tangle was not meant to undercut Espio. It's that she's the other side of the coin. She sees the positive side of what Sonic is doing, and Espio sees the negative side. And that's just their different personalities and worldviews.
Right. Here's the reason why I still say it's undercutting. I don't think that was your intention. The reason why I say it's undercutting is because at the end of the day, when you're having a discussion like that, or having a thematic discussion like that, what you end up ending on is the one that ultimately ends up ending on is usually the one that's considered the correct position, especially if that one that you end on doesn't get countered in any way. And while I would argue the arc itself should be a counter, when we get to the end of, I believe, 40, when we end up getting to 43, 44, where Sonic is reflecting on everything and still just decides to say, I'm standing by my positions no matter, instead of giving into my fear, you can, I get that there's supposed to be counter arguments, there's supposed to be two sides of that argument, but when one basically gets a page and the other one gets basically gets an entire half of the chapter, and that half of the chapter is never given a proper direct counter argument, how is that not undercutting?
I can see where you're coming from, but at the same time, this book is not meant to be a balanced moral debate.
And that's, we'll come back to that later. So let's move on to my next section. So let's start speaking. Okay, so speaking when it comes to the ethical debate and finally getting a chance to jump into the villains properly, Star. So we have spent about 3 years of this book with him. and not only multiple issues in the main line, but him ultimately getting 2 miniseries to the side. And I kind of have to ask, especially since now at 51, where at the very least his position is questionable, the position of where he's going to come back or not is in question. My question for you is, what was the point of even having him here? Like, my thing about antagonists is that the antagonists are there for the explicit purpose of challenging the protagonist in some way, if not as a direct conflict, either physically or thematically, at least bring up a conflict for them in some way that they have to reflect on. But Starline has like 2 interactions with interacts with the main characters like twice. And for the most part, neither one of them really are meant to invoke any type of conflicts with them directly. So why is he here at all? Is my question. Because like his motivation is more about dealing with Eggman than actually being an antagonist to the main characters. So what's even the point of having him?
He was entertaining. We got fun and interesting interactions between him and the extended cast. He is an antagonistic force against Eggman rather than the main heroes. And the legacy that he's created with Surge and Kit will be explored further from there. Well, he doesn't exist just for Sonic.
Well, that's the thing. If we talk about, like, here's the thing. When it comes to both Eggman and Surge and Kit, we have different problems. When it comes to Eggman, he honestly does less for him. Like, when we end up getting to 50, or like everything that we've been up with him up to this point, like especially in Bad Guys, he's not even really a footnote he's not even on Eggman's radar to any degree. When Eggman ends up seeing like all this stuff that ends up happening to one of his bases, he just kind of assumes that is Zavok, but then just puts that to the side and doesn't even really seem to think Starling would even be capable of this. Then when you end up getting to 50, he's able to pretty much break down everything he's able to do with he's able to basically work through everything that Starling was doing with relative ease. And is basically just able to one-shot. And is basically more or less able to take him down without really any type of conflict to him. So I'm already not super wild about giving villains that much attention, but giving them development. But even in terms of giving Eggman development, he doesn't really do much as a proper challenge for him. If anything, Eggman just kind of blows through him. As well as for Surge and Kit, we'll come to Surge and Kit. So how is he supposed to be effective? How is he an antagonist for Eggman anyway?
He took over his entire city.
For 5 minutes.
Yeah, and then he got stomped because Eggman is the better villain.
So how is that meant to be a challenge for Eggman anyway when it's not, when he basically ends up able to defeat him that easily? Like, how does that work as a challenge? Or how is that meant to show anything off about Eggman that we couldn't get or benefit from Eggman doing that to the protagonist?
Well, because you see Starline build up to this point. He goes through multiple plans. He accounts for so many variables. He gets into the meta-contextual of the story so that when he is finally in this precipice of look at how far he's come, how much work he's put into it to get to this point, and then Eggman is able to counter and crush him, you see just how much of a threat Eggman is. Someone who is this close to him, someone who understands him that deeply, someone who can make that big of a play against him is still not enough.
Okay. This is where the issue with, this is actually one of the issues I have with Eggman in particular. So first off, this is meant to be more or less game Eggman, or at the very least based off of game Eggman, which while he can cause some damage, he's never meant to be someone who is meant to be a hardcore threat. He's just meant to be like a couple steps above Team Rocket. So if anything, him kind of being like this maniacal villain, I'm not totally sure how that's supposed to, if anything, that just kind of brings up a weird contrast for his interactions with Sonic, if he's able to be this thoroughly, again, be able to beat Starline this thoroughly. And that's also kind of weirder because one of the main excuses I got for the Metal Virus arc, especially for how he just pretty much dropped the ball on that entirely, was that, he's game Eggman, he's not that great, he's just kind of like, he's very intelligent, but he is incredibly reckless, he doesn't think anything through, he's just that easily defeatable. Yeah, it's kind of cool that we got to see Eggman be like this over the top and just slam Starline to the ground, which, to be clear, I like that. I do like seeing him do that, but why have Eggman zigzag as a character like this?
That's how he is in the games. He held a gun to Amy's head, stuffed Sonic in a capsule, launched him into the atmosphere, and tried to blow him up.
Right, but that wasn't like some 10-stage plan. In Sonic Adventure 2, he more or less just pulls a gun on Amy as a final resort. It's not like him like...
Well, you try to say he's a Team Rocket goofball when he clearly is not. He's blown up planets.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to manually detonate a missile to level Station Square, which he was already trying to wipe out just to pave it over and put a theme park on it.
Mm-hmm.
He's goofy. He's theatrical. But he has always been a top-tier threat.
He's been a threat in the sense that he can cause damage, but he's never been someone who's able to like, oh yeah, I know every last thing about what you can do. I've been studying you for months, and I'm able to like just break down everything that you can do this instantaneously, especially for someone like Starlink who hasn't even been considering him. So I was calling him somewhat near Team Rocket, not in the sense that he can't do damage. Well, and also to be fair, Team Rocket has done damage sometimes. Not to say that he can't do damage, he can. But more, he's always been like a couple of steps beyond them in the sense of he can come up with a couple stage plans, but he's never been someone who's able to be someone who's able to just like completely, thoroughly beat someone like that outside of beat someone like that outside of Archie. Like you can kind of count forces, but like what? So kind of count forces, but that's a whole other thing that kind of has the other problems with the rest of the franchise, especially for like. He was able to keep Sonic in prison for 6 months. But the issue I have in particular is just forget bringing out the rest of the games. Just in context of the comic. How does having Eggman be this thorough when it comes to knowing how to manipulate Starline into burning out his power core when it comes his tricore, knowing how to counter his gloves, apparently already having all the information about what he was doing with Surgeon Kid, but then he doesn't think through, hey, maybe I should make sure that my metal virus doesn't mutate. Like, how do those two, like, how does that make sense in one character?
Well, first, he didn't just come up with a counter to Starline on the fly. In Bad Guys, it was clear that he realized it wasn't Zavok who had done all this, it was somebody else.
Right.
And that once Starline made his play, he was able to put the pieces together. And because he is a genius, he was able to put together the plan on the fly to counter and take care of it.
Right.
There is a degree of arrogance in which he thought he could control the metal virus, and he was working to find a way to regain control over it. It's not like he was just existing in a vacuum and oblivious to the problem that it was becoming.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of what Starline's argument is that Eggman is inconsistent in his execution, that he can plan and execute these large scale operations, and then he'll miss the detail for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is Starline is not an unbiased person here. His observations are clearly colored by his own egotism and rampant fanboyism. Now, perhaps the issue there is that we get a lot of his point of view and we don't get a lot of the counterexample until his thesis is put into practice and we see the result. But at the same time, I feel like if we just sat down and had an exposition dump of why he's wrong, that'd be kind of boring and it doesn't really move things along.
Well, it's not that I needed an like a sit down and had to exposit everything about why he's wrong. It's just more why did we dedicate? It's more about why dedicate a year to having this one character set up the fact that why dedicate an entire year just to end on the character being wrong and more or less being dying off, especially when it comes to this character being an antagonist of another antagonist. Like, I understand that you can't develop or take the main characters too far away from how they're establishing the game. I understand that, and I understand that frustration. But why do we need to spend a year doing that with Starline? Is my question. Like, why spend a year doing that with Starline? My question is more why spend a year? Why introduce a character? Why spend all this time doing that for Starline? Why spend all this time to establish that Starline is? Why spend this much time to establish that this one character is wrong about this one thing. That is basically an antagonist of an antagonist. Why spend this much time to do that?
Well, it's not like that was the exclusive use of Starline, though.
Mm-hmm.
He was an
No,
antagonist.
but that's just one of the things. I have other things about him in particular that I kind of want to try to see if I can get to, but that's like the main thing I'm kind of curious about.
But ultimately, it's a story about a bad person doing bad things and getting his comeuppance. And it didn't derail the main series. We used him as an avenue to explore the other villains and to introduce new threats and to be the occasional villain or antagonist force to the main heroes. He served more roles than just to die.
Right. No. I'm not saying that he didn't do more things. I know he did more things. If anything, that's something. Again, that's something else I want to get to. My issue is more about when it comes to the end of this. When it comes to this particular story thread, why spend this much time just to have his arc end on him realizing that he's wrong? Especially, you know what? No, let's just move on from that question. So here's my okay. So let's move on. I'll come back to Starline if I have something else, but I want to talk about Search and Kit for a second. So I remember. So this is also. I know you can't go into this much detail, but I'm looking just more for a thematic idea about what you're trying to. What ultimately is the thematic idea about what is ultimately the point of them. So when it comes to Search and Kit, while we spent about a year dealing with them and setting them up for issue 50, I kind of have to ask what, not necessarily what in terms of story beats, but what thematically is supposed to be the challenge that they were supposed to present. They were supposed to present to Sonic and Tails. Does that make sense, or do I need to say that again?
Yeah, trying to think how best to answer.
Okay.
And Kyle, please liberally cut out my silence as I ponder.
Don't worry, I got you.
I don't think I can say there's much of a grand overarching theme so much as it was the next step in their story.
Okay.
Imposter syndrome was the origin story and the establishing for the conflict, and 50 was the climax of that. Surge's worldview is established and challenged. Kit is employed in what he thinks he's supposed to do, and the primary construction of him to just be a weapon is undercut when Tails shows him compassion. That is something that was never factored in by Starline or anyone else. So it's all these grand plans, these, kind of meta-contextual, this is how we're going to deconstruct things and subvert them. And ultimately, it's the purity and the simplicity of what is there that overcomes, if you want to build a theme around that.
Well, here's the problem. That makes sense if I'm looking directly at Search and Kit. That's not what I was talking about. I'm asking, how are they supposed to be functional antagonists for Sonic and Tails?
In what regard?
So basically the same thing. When it comes to the idea of them being, if not a progression of their story, at least another step in terms of their journey, or hell, just as a general episodic character moment, how are Sonic and Tails supposed to benefit from, or how are these two meant to be good antagonists for challenging them?
Well, they've just been introduced to the main storyline. We haven't explored that at all. But that's the thing, and that's what makes it kind of so curious. That's what I end up finding so fascinating and kind of curious about them. We've also just spent an entire year setting them up. They got introduced in Sonic 46. They got their own miniseries, and then we just got them introduced and then they got properly introduced into the comic in issue 50. So the issue here is not that they haven't had enough time. We've gotten enough time. Hell, and not only that, they got a chance to directly interact and confront these two. If they weren't going to be a proper conflict for them then, we should be able to see what the conflict that they were supposed to bring up for them then is supposed to be. So why wouldn't issue 50 be the moment that we're building up to how there's supposed to be a challenge for them in some way, if not a physical threat, definitely in terms of being a thematic threat for them in some way. You keep trotting out passages of time. We've had 5 issues. Real time doesn't factor in here. We haven't had the page count to fully explore things.
Right.
And
but
their story has just begun. Their confrontation in 50 is another point in the line. Things will grow and be explored from there.
Hold on. This is a point I get a lot from your fans, and I get fine. I think it might be a little unfair about how I keep bringing up passes of time. I bring that up because that's how much time that's ultimately dedicated in real time to like putting out this kind of content for them. Yeah, we can bring this down to issues, but 5 issues aren't just like just pages or just a couple of moments. They should be doing things that we're trying to establish how they are supposed to be thematic threats. And again, we just had them fight. We just saw them fight in 50. If they're not if there were going to be some type of challenge or conflict for them at some point, wouldn't it have been in issue 50? Like, why would we need to wait for several more issues for them to start being a challenge for them?
They were a challenge. Tails was spent on the run the entire time until he managed to talk Kit down and trick him into using up his reservoir. Sonic and Surge were fighting tooth and nail to a stalemate with the occasional break until Sonic managed to get a good hit in on Surge, and she basically pieced out because she was morally kind of thrown for a loop. They barely got through their encounters. Okay,
here's the problem. As a physical threat, we're going to come back here. There's a reason why I was asking about Shonen in particular. Because when you end up bringing that up, this might not be the way that you were trying to bring it up, but when I'm thinking Shonen, fights are never just there for fights. They're just there for fights. They're just there to be physical threats. If they are physical threats, it's meant to be pushing the character to either give an idea about like what they need to do to physically become stronger, or what ways that they are weak in some way. And usually thematically, it's usually meant to be some type of conflict for their either motivation or their worldview, and putting that to proper contrast. Like we see, I know this happens in My Hero Academia. I know this happens, and this is consistently a thing throughout Shonen. Now, this might not be a way that you were trying to do that here, but if the whole idea is that these guys are supposed to be physical threats, actually, that's a better way to ask it. So, are these two just meant to be physical, just up to this point, only meant to be physical threats? They're not meant to have any type of thematic, or really any type of challenge for Sonic and Tails in particular, especially for anything that they need to either grow from or have to deal with any type of character conflict with, besides just them kind of being physically challenging.
Well, it wasn't just physical. Again, Kit was ultimately undermined by Tails' compassion. He was built to basically be this support unit for Surge with no true positive emotional bond.
Mm-hmm.
And Tails, having the perspective of someone who has been an underdog, who has been on the receiving end of being looked down on, was able to reach a part of Kit that nobody has addressed. And that was how he was able to overcome the immediate physical threat.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, Surge her entire identity has been built on the fight with Sonic. Her entire motivation has been, I have to destroy him. And she had a certain mindset for that going in. And when confronting him, and his response is, we don't have to do this. You can walk away. We don't even have to be friends, but it doesn't have to be this way. She fell apart. A lot of their conflict is her desperately trying to rationalize why she has to do this, why she has to be an antagonist.
Okay, here's the thing. When we keep asking this question, you keep kind of shifting it over to Surge and Kit. I'm asking more.
That's the story.
Right. Why isn't this story for Sonic and Tails is my question.
Because they're the main characters and we're going to be seeing them for the rest of the book. This is the culmination of Surge and Kit in the context of the relationship with Sonic and Tails, and now that we've established this point, we grow and continue from there.
Well, here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. While, yes, they are Sonic and Tails are supposed to be the main characters, Tails hasn't gotten any proper character moment since outside of maybe issue 1. He hasn't really gotten any form of like a character conflict outside of at best when he had to like fight a bunch of those zombies. So that's not really meant to show anything. That's not really meant to properly challenge in the sense of forcing him to reflect on something about himself and having to overcome that in some way. He just has to deal with some villains has to deal with some attacks in front of him, and he has to get through it. that's what I'm kind of asking for here. I'm not saying that Surge and Kit can't get development. And I have my own problems, and I kind of want to go a little bit more into that in a second. But when it comes to Sonic and Tails, that's what I'm kind of curious about, because I'm like, if you're going to have these two characters here, why wouldn't they be doing something for Sonic and Tails' story? Because every single time I keep asking about this, you keep reflecting on how it's supposed to be benefiting Surge and Kit. I'm asking how it's supposed to benefit Sonic and Tails.
That's what we're going to be exploring going forward.
Okay, so then I guess the question is, why wouldn't that have been in their first conflict?
So you want to introduce the conflict for Sonic and Tails and resolve it in a single issue when they first encountered their antagonists.
No, I didn't say that. I do think it should be introduced it should be at least introduced the first time that they end up encountering each other, especially when they end up getting into a fight. But I'm not saying they had element. I'm not saying it had. Okay, so what was it supposed to be?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're asking for.
Okay. We will. Okay, so I'll shift over a little bit from there. So when it comes to the fights in particular, you know what? We'll move away from that. So let's talk about the themes. So one of the things that we talked about last time was that you wanted to have a theme about whenever you make a decision, no matter how badly the consequences from it come out, always make sure that you stand by your principles, correct?
I don't remember that exactly, but sure, we'll run with that.
Okay. So what is the difference between that and just blind stubbornness?
There may not be. It's up to personal interpretation, I imagine.
Okay, so this is where this is where a lot of criticism tends to come from around how the themes for the Laviarray saga were supposed to go. No one is as far as I can tell, no one has been, as all the critics that I'm aware of, no one has been saying that they want any of the villains to die off. But why have the position be that Sonic refuses to refuses to really learn from anything from this and continue to make excuses for either his actions or his inactions when it comes to the consequences that came out from that. Not only in terms of the ultimate actions that he did when it comes to letting Laviarray go and doing very little to have any safeguards around Tinker, but also when it comes to his inactions about like what happened with Surge and Kit. Like, I get the idea that Surge is ultimately meant to. I get the idea that what I think you're trying to go for is Surge only is looking to fight Sonic more or less out of her brainwashing. But at the end of the day, she still kind of has a point that his inaction around dealing with both these two, especially Starline, did lead to all of her stuff, or lead to her getting kidnapped, brainwashed, and experimented on. So, like, why have Sonic continue to just double down on a position, regardless of how much suffering that comes out of it?
See, I specifically asked that we not go to this one again because I'm really tired of it online.
All right, fair enough. All right, so no asking about Sonic. Fair enough.
No more beating the dead horse of the morality of Sonic that's baked into the character from the game stuff. There are differing viewpoints on it that have entrenched themselves, and anything I say at this point is either going to galvanize those who champion it or further piss off the people who don't agree with it. I'm just really tired of that debate, and I have nothing fresh to bring to the discussion.
All right, fair enough. So going back to Surge and Kit for a second. So I remember at one point that it seemed like at one point you were alongside with Stanley trying to set them up as being clones. But from my understanding, SEGA said no. SEGA ultimately said no because they didn't want to have Starline become. They didn't want to have Starline become. It seemed like he's strong. He's smarter than Eggman in some way and be able to basically come up with clones instantaneously. So they more or less shifted into getting the android treatment from Dragon Ball Z. Correct?
Yes and no. That's kind of a telephone version of it.
Oh,
the original pitch was that they would be fully synthetic beings, not clones. something like a shadow android, but better. And that was flagged as too advanced. They didn't want him eclipsing Eggman in that regard, which, fair enough. His robot doubles are like Metal Sonic and Mecha Sonic. They're not exactly lifelike. So then we dialed it back to the cyborg thing, which I believe was Sega's suggestion.
Okay. So when you were ultimately given a suggestion from them, I'll bring it back this way. So right now at this point, we've kind of established that they are meant to have some form of connection to them, Surge and Kid are meant to have some form of a connection to Sonic and Tails genetically, as well as also being brainwashed, as well as having robotic parts planted inside of them, on top of being kidnapped children. I'm kind of curious.
There is some mystery to it still on purpose.
Okay, let's just say this. Okay, I'll take the kidnapping thing out for a second. So, I guess my question is, why have so much detail go into them on that front instead of just why have like so many weird weird parts to them instead of just having them be ultimately being like, I don't want to give ideas, but why have I'll keep it simple. Why have so many different things have to be influenced for their backgrounds? Why have them have so much in their backgrounds?
Well, it's complicated if you go into the micro details like that, but at the macro level, Starline used a variety of tools to turn these randos into counterparts to Sonic and Tails, two of the greatest heroes on the planet. Yeah, you can get into the nitty gritty saying that he got biodata and stole DNA samples and is using cybernetics and inert forms of metal virus and yada, yada, yada. But the elevator pitch is he just engineered the two of them to be comparable to Sonic and Tails.
Okay, so
all the minutia is there for, the hardcore fans who want to see that connection and, look at all these nods and how it all connects. But for someone who just doesn't get all that, there's the higher level, just he made them better.
Okay, so the question I kind of have to ask is, okay, well, actually, we'll stay on this for a second. So why have them, but even then, even if you're just looking for, like, the people are looking to the hard details, like, why have so many different things for them instead of just, like, kind of streamlining it in some way? Because, like, that's
literally just answered that, man.
Never mind. I'll put this. Okay, so I think the better way to, where is this? So, okay, so so I want to ask this for a friend. I have another question in particular. So feel free to cut this out feel free to cut this out, but this is something I'm kind of curious about. So is Surge meant to have any type of connection or inspiration based off of Scourge?
See, the thing is that the very nature of that question is so loaded that even a simple answer can be taken in different directions.
Okay.
How best to safely say this without riling certain parties? Surge is in her construction based on the Ashura glitch and an exploration of her own character. She stands on her own 2 feet. Let's say that. That's not saying you're presenting a loaded question. I'm just saying the question itself by its very nature.
All right, so this is more of like a general thing, not necessarily in terms of, especially since this more or less came up in Tangle versus Whisper. But I'm kind of curious, when it comes to dealing with antagonists, when it comes to dealing with antagonists, or at least when it comes to having the debate around how to deal with antagonists, why does it seem like, why kind of frame the situation where the only two options seem to be either killing or letting them go? Like, killing them, letting them go in a certain sense, because a lot of times, a lot of the debates that come up within the conversation seems to be framing around those things, especially if you can not only come up with other ways to deal with them when prison directly does exist in this universe. So, if I may ask, like, why have the debate more or less boiled down to only those two options?
I'm trying to think where that really came up, and those are primarily within the context of Mimic, who is just a vile piece of work and would have deserved everything he got, and Eggman, who has done monstrous things.
All right, so let's
I guess I can't remember exactly how we had the exchange between Zavok and Sonic, but the Deadly Six's worldview does not really include any form of mercy, but that's their damage.
Right. So I guess this in particular. Okay, so really we can mainly bring this around when it comes to both Mimic as well as when it comes to the Deadly Six. So when it comes to Mimic, I'm actually just kind of curious why that conflict was even really there. Why have that conflict even be there in the first place? Like, if the whole idea is that Mimic deserve, if you even agree that Mimic deserves everything that he should get to him, why have a story that's about? Why have the very end of the story end with Whisper, with Tangle having to talk Whisper down from killing him?
Because mercy is a good thing that we should be teaching the children's.
So I agree, but my problem here is why frame that. Here's the thing: I am also all for mercy as well, but why frame that around? Why even frame that not only around monstrous people? Why even not only frame that around monstrous people, but why even bring that conflict up for Whisper in the first place? Who, for the most part, killing hasn't really been that much of her. Well, actually, no, I'll take that back. Why even frame it around those two being the only options? Well, why bring that up as a even conflict for Whisper in the first place?
Why not?
Well, as much as I'm all for that as an answer, I'm kind of just more curious about, like, why is it even here?
I don't see why it is an issue. We understand why Whisper is angry and would want to take that route, and ignoring that entirely, I would feel like would be the bigger question. Why would she not even consider that?
Okay. I'll come back around to that. We'll just move on from there. So here's the other thing about when it comes to the Zeti. So I get the idea. So I'm not saying that anyone needed to have to directly kill them, but why put them, besides just the very concept of they need to be back on there for they need to go back to the Hex because that's where they are in the games. Why send them back to the Hex instead of just putting them in a prison that, as far as we can tell, was being effective?
Because then it becomes it's Chekhov's gun, basically. If they are in a prison, you're waiting for them to break out of that prison. You're asking, where is it in relationship to Restoration HQ and the rest of the world? What are the safeguards? Is it the same prison they were in before? It's a lot of questions and a lot of set pieces that would have to be established. But if they get punted back to Lost Hex, which they have no means of leaving, it accomplishes the same goal as removing them from the narrative, while also having the bonus of restoring their status quo for whenever SEGA decides to do something with them.
Yes, but my problem is that when you're trying to have this whole ethical dilemma around how to deal with villains being like present throughout most of the book, it kind of comes off like as a bit of a half measure. Like, yeah, they end up getting sent back to the Lost Hex. And that works as a good status quo from them. But they're also unrestrained and unwatched. So people are still going in with the idea of, oh yeah, they're going to be back at some point. Like, that's one of the main responses I get from a lot of IDW fans. Like, oh yeah, they're going to be back at some point. So if we're going to be dealing with that regardless, why not put them somewhere where they are watched, where they are restrained, and they can't just where they are watched and restrained? Because in either place, there is still always that potential that they're going to come back. They're still mainstay villains. But in one position, they are both not only put under lock and key. If they do ever decide to break out, there's a good in-universe reason. There's a good way in-universe for them to know. Like, if they break out, people will know that they're on the move and they have to look out for them. Versus they're on the Lost Hex where no one is, and they can just go ahead and scheme and get ready. And whenever they do get a chance to break out, no one's going to know about them being there until they get on the. No one's going to know about them being free until they're on the planet actively causing problems.
because, as I said, they can't get off Lost Hex. Sonic's been there. He knows they don't have the infrastructure or the means to leave the planet.
Except the Melvirus arc actually has them getting off the planet. Granted, it's with Starline using the using the warp topaz. But at the end of the day, they still were able to get off. As far as we can tell, and honestly, putting them in a prison, it's a fantasy setting. You can make prisons as effective as you want them. Make prisons as effective as you want them to be. So, how would a fancy prison with a proper locking system not deal with that problem?
Because we've already established that the fancy locking system doesn't hold them either.
But again, but that's the reason why.
And for the same reason, they couldn't assume that Starline would have a hypno glove and go in and break them out. You can't account for some random jerk somewhere is going to break them out of prison or beam them off of Lost Hex.
Right. No.
It's the same thing. So why not go ahead and do what is established in world, as they know that it can't readily escape, and give us the benefit of long-term relationships with the game material.
Because again, but I know I was a little worried, but I kind of covered that. The whole idea is that if they're in prison, if they do end up getting if they are broken out, people are if they are able to broke out. Not only do they not have is it a lot easier to make sure that they haven't spent all that time trying to come up with a new plan for what they can do next. People are able to be aware that, hey, these guys are going to lose. We need to make sure that we keep an eye out. We need to keep an eye out for them. Like at the end of the day, it's a much while they are still on the planet, it's a lot easier to know if they do get out that you need to keep an eye out for them versus if they get off the Lost Hex, you have no idea where they're going to be.
Unless they get out of jail and there's no witnesses of where they went and they go into hiding, in which case you have no idea where they're going to be.
Except you still know that. Except you would also still know that they would know they wouldn't be in prison anymore.
Whoop-de-doo. That makes zero difference.
Actually, it kind of does. The whole idea about
and if they get reintroduced and there's a storyline in the games that comes from Lost Hex, then that means we have to scramble to account for why they're not in jail anymore in our book.
Correct.
It accomplishes this. So we accomplishes the same goal of removing them from the immediate narrative without adding an extra wrinkle on our end, on the licensing side of things, for what is at most a negligible plot beat.
So here's the reason why here's the thing. I actually do agree with you on that, but my issue here is more if you're going to have a regular theme and be about how to deal with villains properly, why it's kind of a bit of a cop-out to say, yeah, we need to do this to make sure it matches up with the games. If you have to do that, if you constantly have to deal with that concept when it comes to if you're constantly trying to deal with a theme, but it has to constantly get undermined because of external problems, why have that theme in the first place? Because at the end of the day, like I said, if they break, not only could they be on lock and key a lot more, lock and key, if they do break out, you do have to know about what the people who are supposed to be watching them would be able to have at least some idea about that they did break out and keep an eye out for them. So if you have to come up with an answer that makes it that's an out of universe problem, why have that theme here at all?
That's a balancing act of a licensed book, is to tell an engaging enough story while also being mindful that this is not your narrative to fully control. So finding ways that make enough sense within the universe to resolve it is what you do. Whether that's satisfying for everybody, your mileage may vary.
Okay. All right. So this gets to another. So I kind of want to bring up another question in particular. So a while ago, correct me if I'm wrong, when someone actually no, that still deals with the debate. I'll just move on from that. So when it comes to actually, you know what? So I want to go ahead and move away from villains, and I want to talk about a couple of the OCs in particular, if you don't mind. So, like I said last time, I am totally fine with having new characters in the book. I think that's honestly kind of a requirement for an adventure series. But one thing again that I'm kind of curious about is when it comes to Tangle, because one of the things that we were talking about at the beginning was that one of the things we were talking about at the beginning during the Game Informer interview was that Tangle was supposed to be like one of the one of the new characters who's going to be like one of the new female leads. She's going to be able to bounce off of and interact with Sonic exceptionally well. But by the time we get to the book, however, by the time we end up getting to help pretty much by, we'll just go into say issue 48, she hasn't had like one conversation with Sonic since issue 25. And for the most part, her entire relationship has been more focused on either her relationship with Whisper, or kind of being a bit of a wise guy to Belle's straight man. So I'm kind of curious, like, how is she supposed to tie back in with the main cast or really benefit the story on the whole, other than just kind of being another plucky girl for two of the other characters to kind of bounce off of occasionally?
Yeah, she kind of grew in her own direction in ways that I don't think any of us were really expecting. She was, built primarily within the context of, the Sonic franchise. And then her rapport with Whisper really blew up, and the stories have just kind of fallen in that direction. And she's kind of taken on a life of her own, not so much as her own character arc, because she isn't really carrying a story on her own, but she's proved to be very versatile within the extended cast. So she's still around. She can still be steered back to Sonic, but that's just the way that the stories have happened to fall out as time's gone on.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go ahead and wrap up with this one more question about. I'll go ahead and end with this. When it comes to the restoration in particular, I get the idea that was originally meant to be the Resistance, and one thing led to another, and it was probably just better to go and ship them over to be the Restoration. However, by the time we've gotten to issue 48, no one in the main cast is even on the not only is no one on the main cast even a part of the Restoration at this point. The Restoration, I'm not entirely sure what is even supposed to do, because for all intents and purposes, we haven't really seen any haven't seen them actually like working to build anything. So I guess I'm asking at this point, like, what is even the role or the particular purpose of having them in the story at this point? Especially since besides Jewel, no one is really even directly associated with it anymore.
It's kind of endured despite itself. It was the Resistance at first, and then at the end of Neo Metal, Sega said, end the Resistance. We don't want that in play anymore. But the question remains, you have this organization built to protect the world. How do you just hand wave that off? So we did the Restoration angle. We had Amy struggling to keep that running, handing it over to Jewel. And now it's slowly kind of being pushed in this direction of, it is the force that kind of exists in the world to help undo whatever damages come across as the stories go along. It's not meant to be a forefront element. It's just this kind of background explanation of, okay, the metal virus ravaged cities. Who's rebuilding this stuff? People got mixed up and shifted around by it. Who helps them find their way home? Eggman attacked another village somewhere. Who's going to help with the cleanup? Well, there's these guys in the background, and you know that they're doing it. So you can focus on the moment-to-moment action beats without dwelling on the minutia of work orders and construction and rebuilding. You just know that it's occurring in the world. It's also convenient here and there when Jewel is able to coordinate with those elements around the world to say, hey, there's a threat here, so that the heroes don't have to necessarily stumble into each adventure. That isn't something that should be relied on. The same plot beat of, hey, bad thing, go there, would be tiresome. And I think that starts to see you closer to the old Freedom Fighter model. They were basically a superhero team, either operating out of Knothole or some other location, and they were stationary to one place, reacting to outside threats. That's what I want to steer away from. Sonic is about travel and journeying and adventuring, so I want him mobile, not tied to a base. That's what I mean.
Okay, actually, Okay, so I want to go and keep that quick, but honestly, that opened up something else that I do want to follow up on because that's where I thought you were going. But here's the thing: I'm just kind of curious about, and this is something I've noticed a lot in a different within fan takes. But I'm really curious about why. I'm really curious about you in particular. So I get the idea about not wanting to have Sonic be too tied down to one particular base. You want him to be an adventurer. You want to be able to have him go in different locations. But why does that mean not? Why have that mean not have really like a core cast for him to interact with, if I may ask? Because besides at best Tails and to a certain extent Amy, he hasn't really had like a lot. He doesn't really like have a bunch of different characters to really like properly be able to interact with and contrast with. Now, I have my own issues with how that worked with the Freedom Fighters, but why have that not be here at all so we can have a better idea about how to not only develop him, but also in terms of helping to develop the other handful of characters that interact with him on a regular basis too?
I honestly am not sure what you mean because, as you said, he has Tails and Amy. He has the Chaotix. He has Knuckles when he's around. He has
here's the
Tangle
thing.
and Whisper. They don't have to necessarily be attached at his heels at all times. It's where he goes and what the story necessitates.
Well, there's a reason why I'm saying that. Like, we'll just stick to the two examples I brought up. Yeah, he has interacted with Tails and Amy over the course of the last 50 issues, but for the most part, most of those interactions have really just been about them either explaining the plot or ultimately coming up with strategy. Most of those interactions that they've had to this point haven't really been for either direct personal character interaction or bouncing off each other's worldviews, which is one of the benefits of having an ensemble. And that's just with Tails and Amy that's been an issue. He's really not done that at all with anyone else other than at best Shadow with issue 6. So why not? So it's not just in the sense of, yeah, he can interact with characters, but why not give him why not have him have why not have a cast and make this look more character centric instead of just only having them interact as from your words when it's necessary in the story?
So why does he have a cast to interact with except when he doesn't interact with them? I'm not following what you're asking.
So when I say cast, I don't just mean any character that's in the story. When I'm talking about cast, I mean the central primary cast, the core characters that are meant to show up on a regular basis within the story itself. Like if I'm going to use The Simpsons, for example, the main cast is the Simpson family, and we have major secondary and background characters within that as well. So when I'm talking about cast, I'm not just talking about in terms of The Simpsons. I'm not talking about Moe or Smithers or Seymour Skinner. When I'm talking about cast, I'm talking Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and I guess Maggie to a certain extent. So when I'm talking about cast here, why not give him? When I'm talking about core cast, I mean the characters that are to show up on a regular, almost 90% of the time are supposed to show up in the books. Versus Chaotix would even qualify for that. They are meant to be main second for how they've been used up to the book. They're mainly secondary characters that can show up and be relevant. When I'm talking about main cast, I'm talking about characters that are supposed to show up on a direct, regular basis.
Well, in the Simpsons example, or let's say X-Men or Cowboy Bebop or anything else, your core cast has a centralized location. The Simpsons are a family. They're always going to come home to each other, and that facilitates the slower-paced character interaction. The crew of the Bebop, who all have their own individual goals and stuff, are always coming back to the Bebop. That's a very gross simplification, I know, but for the sake of argument.
But hold on.
The X-Men have the mansion, they have Krakoa, they have their centralized location where they come in to chill out and interact on that personal level. Sonic does not. He is always on the move, and he is, as the tagline goes, the fastest thing alive, So if we were to have a group constantly on the move with him, there needs to be an explanation of why they are keeping up with him and why they're giving up their day-to-day lives to be going with him wherever he happens to be going.
Okay. Two things. One, while I brought up The Simpsons as an example, any adventure series would end up qualifying for what you're talking about. Like that's Pokemon and Avatar at the end. That's Pokemon and Avatar at the end of the day. But when it comes to coming up with the character motivation as to why that would come in, like that's. I'm not saying that you wouldn't have to work with SEGA to a certain degree to figure out like who would make the most sense there, but who would make them how would you come up with those motivations to work there? But that's something I don't think that would be off the table to write into the story, especially when it comes to Tails, Amy, and possibly whoever else you think could work. So those aren't disqualifying. So why would that? So the first one, the primary one, you can set up either do what Underground did or do what you did in Archie, or even better, just or hell, just even as a joke, Sonic and like drag them around or whatever. That's pretty much whatever you're creating. That's something that you can come up with. And when it comes to the latter, that's also just how they end up traveling around with each other. That's how you can come up with that. And same thing goes for character motivations. So those are both easily able to get. Those are both something that I don't think SEGA would be against you for. So again, like you can overcome those. So why would those even be an issue?
Well, fair enough. Avatar is a good example, but there again, the gang is going with a purpose as a group. They have a universal goal driving them together. So to facilitate that kind of story with Sonic and Tails, Amy, Tangle, whoever, there would need to be that overarching need for them to work in tandem, which the book just hasn't done yet.
Right, but why not do that up to... again, that's just a character motivation. You can put that in, and I'm asking more like, why not do that up to this point?
Because that's not the stories we came up with.
Okay. All right. Those are pretty much all my questions in particular.
All righty. Anything you want to plug here at the end of the show? Anywhere you want to send folks?
I'm on Twitter and Tumblr at Laviarray, so feel free to check me out. Check me out at either sites.
Spell that out for the folks who don't quite get it.
Sure. It's Laviarray.
Alrighty. Kyle, do you have anything you want to add here at the end?
Nope, I do not.
Well, shut up already. You've been just dominating this whole show. Go back to your corner.
I know. I'm looking forward to what weird quotes 4chan is going to make up about this episode this time.
Oh, don't encourage them.
I don't have to. They're already going to.
Well, big thank you to Laviarray for coming back and sponsoring yet another episode. We hope everyone has enjoyed, and we will see you next time on the BumbleKast.
You've been listening to the BumbleKast, a co-production of Bumble King Comics and the KNGI Network. Original theme music composed by Ken Coda Snyder. Remixed intro by T-Lopes. Find out more information, along with podcast feeder links, MP3 downloads, and more at bumbleking.com and kngi.org.